pra Oslo, pra sair no Oslodum. Bloco afro da terra do bacalhau.
Oi, tudo bem? Welcome to this 8th lesson and the special series I'm creating to help you to jumpstart your Brazilian Portuguese. I'm Professor Jason, and today I'll be teaching you about the importance of gender, number, and agreement when using articles, nouns, and adjectives to create phrases in which all of these elements agree. I'll also include a brief review of subject-verb agreement. Now, these aren't super complicated concepts, but keep in mind they are fundamental, super important. So, understanding gender, number, and agreement is extremely important if you want to sound like you know what you're talking about in Brazilian Portuguese. Então, vamos começar. Let's get started. Now, just to give you an idea of how I plan to move through this material, here's the lesson overview. We'll talk about agreement, then we'll also do a brief review of the definite and indefinite article forms. Then we'll focus on nouns. We'll look at their gender, and then consider singular and plural forms. Then a quick overview of what adjectives are, again assuming that you probably already know this. Then we'll talk about adjectives in terms of their gender, masculine and singular forms, and also I'll show you how to make singular forms plural. And finally we'll put it all together. I'll show you a bunch of examples so you'll be able to see that in Brazilian Portuguese, when you have articles, nouns, and adjectives in a phrase or sentence, they all have to agree in terms of number and gender. And finally, just wrap it up with a really quick review of the concept of subject-verb agreement in Brazilian Portuguese. Now, as with many Romance languages, in Brazilian Portuguese, the concepts of gender, number, and agreement are crucial to the formation of grammatical sentences. When it comes to agreement, it's important to keep the basic principles you see on this slide in mind. Remember, nouns are words that refer to people, places, things, concepts, or ideas. So words like brother, home, beach, Europe, hotel, car, love, philosophy, etc. are nouns. When it comes to nouns, we have to keep in mind two important things. They have gender, they're considered either masculine or feminine grammatically, and they also have number. So we have to keep in mind whether they are singular or plural. And of course, singular nouns can be made plural. The principles of gender and number also apply to articles and to adjectives and to some other kinds of words. Now remember, adjectives are words used to modify nouns. So words such as big, interesting, yellow, proud, Brazilian, delicious, these would all be adjectives. Now, articles and adjectives must agree in number and gender with the nouns they introduce and modify. That's the key point of this lesson. Let me repeat that. Articles and adjectives must agree in number and gender with the nouns they introduce and modify. That's the main point of our lesson today. And then finally, remember that verb forms have to agree with their subjects. Alright, so on this slide, I'm showing the definite articles, which are the equivalent of the English definite article, the. Only in Portuguese, you have four forms to count for the singular and plural of masculine and feminine nouns. So to introduce something singular and masculine like carro, car, it would be o carro, the cars, os carros. Something feminine like casa, a casa means the house. To make that plural, as casas, feminine plural, the houses, as casas. So now on this second slide, what we have are the indefinite articles in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, which are the equivalents for, in English, a, an, or some. So the masculine singular form is as in a book, livro. Masculine plural, uns, some books, uns livros. Feminine singular would be uma, a plant, uma planta. Feminine plural would be umas, some plants or a few plants, umas plantas. So we discussed these definite and indefinite articles in detail in lesson 4, and you're going to see lots of them used on the slides that follow in this lesson. Keep in mind that they can help to determine the gender of nouns, but that they also have to agree in terms of number. Alright, so now that we have that review of articles out of the way, let's move on to the notion of gender as it applies to nouns. So as with other Romance languages, all nouns in Brazilian Portuguese have a grammatical attribute known as gender, meaning that for the purposes of agreement we're discussing here today, they're grammatically masculine or feminine. So for example, shoe, ring, they're masculine. Coffee cup, flower, they're feminine. So I say grammatically masculine or feminine because in most cases, the gender of a noun was set hundreds of years ago at some point in the evolution of the language. So at this point, it's best to think of gender as an arbitrary grammatical attribute one must learn or acquire. Now, it should also be noted that in most cases, the genders of nouns don't coincide with their having any traits we would associate explicitly or implicitly with their being either male or female. For example, Omar. There's nothing about the C that makes it either male or female. Same with the masculine jardins. There's nothing about gardens that makes it masculine or male. A praia. Why is the beach feminine or female? It just is in Brazilian Portuguese, just as casas or houses is also a feminine noun in Brazilian Portuguese. There are, however, words whose gender does in fact correspond to the idea of biological gender or sex. Of course, these would be words for man, boy, woman, girl, or other terms that refer to persons. Keep in mind also, and this is additional proof of the arbitrary nature of grammatical gender, that certain nouns that are masculine in Spanish are actually feminine in Portuguese, and other nouns that are feminine in Spanish are masculine in Portuguese. So for example, the noun the tree, el árbol, is masculine in Spanish, but its form is considered feminine in Portuguese, a árvore, right? Same with what we have in the picture here, right? The bridge, masculine in Spanish, el puente, feminine in Portuguese, a ponte, right? Also, you have a word like la leche, right? Milk, la leche, in Spanish, feminine, but in Portuguese, masculine, o leite, right? Same with the feminine word for nose in Spanish, la nariz. That same concept is masculine grammatically in Portuguese, o nariz. Now, since the gender assignment, so to speak, of most nouns is arbitrary, as learners of Brazilian Portuguese, we very often won't know whether a particular noun is masculine or feminine. However, it's possible to learn and depend on a few more or less reliable clues for determining the gender of a noun. For example, as is the case with Spanish, most words for nouns which end in the letter O are masculine in Brazilian Portuguese, while most words ending in the letter A are feminine. So, o queijo, o carro, os ovos, because they end in O, are masculine. While a xícara, a maçã, as joias, ending in A, we can bet that they're probably feminine. At this point, it's worth pointing out perhaps something that might be obvious if you already know Spanish, and that's that many nouns referring to persons which end in O, or certain consonants, particularly R, can be feminized, so to speak, by replacing that final vowel or consonant with an A or A. So the same is true of many adjectives. So if you're talking about a person who is o médico, the feminine form is médica. O professor, a professora. Works with adjectives too, so rico, rica. This is just sort of a shortcut when you have a noun or adjective that ends in O, and in the case of nouns, refers to persons. Now, while the basic ends in O or A rule covers a lot of ground in terms of predicting the gender of nouns, it's important to bear in mind that there are numerous exceptions, including a lot of very common words, some of which are on this slide. So, even though dia ends in an A, you can tell by the definite article o that it's masculine. O dia. Another one like that is o mapa, masculine. O planeta, masculine. O samba, masculine. O sofá. All words that end in A, but in fact are grammatically masculine. And then we also have some words that end in O, but grammatically are feminine, such as a foto, a moto, a tribo. And keep in mind also that many nouns in Portuguese end in vowels other than O and A, not to mention certain consonants, particularly L, M, R, S, and Z. And so on this slide, I just pulled out a few examples of words, nouns, that end in vowels other than O and A, or the consonants L, M, Z, R, and S. You can see that some are masculine, o chapéu, o time, o papel, o homem, o azar, o francês, cartaz, while others are feminine. A equipe, a capital, although there is a masculine form, o capital, which refers to money, capital, a nuvem, a flor, a atriz, a voz. So, they can end in vowels other than O and A, as well as other consonants, and so really you have to pay attention to whether or not they're masculine or feminine, and many times that definite article will give you a really good clue. Alright, in addition to the final O or A, there are a few other endings that can correlate fairly reliable in terms of letting us know whether a particular noun in Brazilian Portuguese is masculine or feminine. For example, on this slide, we can see that words that have these endings, these three endings highlighted, tend to be masculine. So if you have a consonant followed by the nasal diphthong ão, such as o cartão, o ladrão, o pão, these tend to be masculine. An exception would be the word for hand, a mão, feminine. Words ending in ma, right? These usually come from Greek. Things like o cronograma, o programa, o dilema, o sistema. These are also masculine in Portuguese. Or words that end in tor or dor, as you can see here, o ator or o computador, are also masculine. In contrast, words in Brazilian Portuguese that end with the six endings you see representing on this slide tend to be feminine. So if it's se cedilha, a o, right, são, they tend to be feminine. A ação, a doação, a nação. One important exception would be the masculine o coração. Or S with a nasal diphthong, a diversão, a divisão, a prisão, feminine. Dade, a capacidade, a cidade, a idade, a personalidade. These are feminine. Dade. Dão, a gratidão, a multidão, a solidão. These are feminine in Brazilian Portuguese. A key exception would be the masculine o cidadão. If they end in gem, right? Gem, a coragem, a garagem, a mensagem, a viagem. These words with this particular ending are feminine in Brazilian Portuguese. And then ude, right? A atitude, a saúde, uma virtude. It's a typo there, but it should be virtude, right? These are also feminine in Brazilian Portuguese. Now there are a few cases where a single form is used to refer to persons of either sex. And the important thing is these nouns refer to people. Here are some common endings where this tends to be the case. So you have words like representante, or estudante, comerciante. I can say the representative if it's a man, o representante. If the rep is a woman, I would say a representante. If it's a male student, o estudante. If it's a female student, a estudante. Same noun form. Same with cliente, gerente, o dentista. If it's a female dentist, a dentista. Male tourist, o turista. Female tourist, a turista. So the exact same noun form for both sexes or genders. Some other common examples that come up a lot in Brazilian Portuguese, well, relatively, o colega or a colega, atleta, modelo, personagem. So if it's a male model, it's o modelo. If it's a female model, it's a modelo. The form is invariable, right? Same with colega. The bottom line really is that when it comes to gender, learners have to pay attention to and make a conscious effort to memorize the gender of every noun they encounter and may want or need to use someday. Aside from remembering the spelling cues I just presented on the previous few slides, another really good, and I think ultimately more reliable strategy is to pay attention to gender cues, such as definite and indefinite articles, adjectives, possessives, and demonstratives, which appear with nouns in authentic reading materials or in the speech of native speakers. So if you hear somebody say, quero comprar sofá, you might think, sofá? But what really is going on is you're being taught sofá is masculine and singular. Or if you read, or if you hear, você tem o mapa. Você tem o mapa. That's telling you that mapa is masculine. Gostei do seu anel dourado. Here the noun anel is surrounded by seu, a masculine singular possessive, and dourado, a masculine singular adjective. So we know that the noun anel is masculine. Você conhece essa cidade peruana? Você conhece essa cidade peruana? Again, cidade, the noun here is surrounded by a demonstrative essa and an adjective peruana, both feminine. What that tells us is that cidade is feminine. So keep in mind also that most language learning materials, including textbooks and dictionaries, will also indicate the grammatical gender of any noun. So basically, when in doubt, look it up. You have to know the gender of nouns. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the concept of number as it applies to nouns in Brazilian Portuguese. Normally when we learn words from a textbook or we look them up in a dictionary, we're going to be introduced to these singular forms. So if I look up the word for book in a bilingual dictionary, I'm going to come across livro or o livro, right? But obviously, as with English, when we're speaking or writing Brazilian Portuguese, we're going to want to pluralize many times nouns. So in the right-hand column, we can see the plural forms of some of the nouns in the left-hand column. So for example, o livro, singular, os livros, plural. A garota, singular, as garotas, plural. Gosto desse carro, singular, car. Gosto desses carros, those cars. Comprei uma caneta, I bought a pen. Comprei umas canetas, I bought some pens. Ele meu professor, eles são meus professores. They are my professors, pluralizing professor. Ele meu irmão, eles são meus irmãos. So as these examples suggest, of course, coming up with plural forms normally isn't all that complicated. So on the next few slides, we'll go over some of the basic rules for pluralizing nouns. Generally speaking, the method used to pluralize a given noun depends on its final letter, the way the word ends. In Brazilian Portuguese, most nouns end in one of these three ways. They either end in a vowel, whether it's accented or not. They might end in certain consonants, particularly L, M, R, S, or Z. And a lot of words, a lot of nouns, end in the nasal diphthong ão, such as decisão or região. So on the slides that follow, I'm going to show how nouns with these endings are generally pluralized. One thing to keep in mind is that these same patterns for pluralizing nouns also apply to making plural singular adjective forms, so we'll come back to them. Okay, first of all, nouns ending in vowels are the easiest to pluralize. You simply add the letter and the sound S, right? So, livro becomes livros. Casa becomes casas. Maçã, apple becomes maçãs. Time becomes times. Moving on to words that end in consonants, right? In the case of most nouns that end in the consonant L, we just remove the L and replace it with IS. So newspaper, jornal, becomes jornais. Capital becomes capitais, right? Anel becomes anéis. Papel, papéis. Lençol, lençóis. Notice the accents in and the open pronunciations of the vowels in the endings of nouns ending in EL and OL. Anéis, papéis, lençóis. Now in the case of nouns ending in M, such as homem or trem, we just remove the M and replace it with NS, but keep in mind that regardless of the spelling change, right, in Brazilian Portuguese, M and N are not really pronounced like their English counterparts in these kinds of cases, right, syllable final. Rather, what they do is they indicate that the preceding vowel is nasalized. So we have homem and homens, trem, trens. There are quite a few nouns in Brazilian Portuguese that end in the consonant are. For example, cobertor, blanket, jogador, player, mulher, woman, professor. So these nouns that end in are, pretty easy to pluralize them. You just add es. Cobertores, jogadores, mulheres, professores. Similarly, in the case of nouns in Brazilian Portuguese that end in z, you pluralize them by adding es. So cartaz is cartazes, luz, luzes, nariz, narizes. Nouns ending in s may take an es ending, or some of them remain unchanged in the plural. So if you have monosyllabic words that end in s, or words stressed on the final syllable, you add es. Examples would be deuses, deuses, meses. Chinês would be chineses. País would be países. Otherwise, right, for words ending in s whose stress falls on a syllable other than the last, plural forms are the same as the singular forms. In other words, nothing changes. Lápis, os lápis. Ônibus, os ônibus. The plural form of nouns ending in the nasal diphthong ão is generally ões. So we have coração becomes corações, decisão, decisões, região, regiões, reunião, reuniões. However, a few common words don't follow this pattern. It's probably best to simply memorize them. So, grão, grãos, irmão, irmãos, órgão, órgãos, alemão, alemães. Those are the most common. Much less frequent nouns would be something like cão, which means dog, cães, or pão, pães. Now this might be complicating things a little bit too much, but I think it's sort of an interesting aside, and that is if you do have nouns that end in the nasal diphthong ão. Spanish speakers have a little bit of an advantage here if they can remember this trick. To determine whether the plural for a word ending in ão should be ões, ãos, or ães, think of the Spanish word and then drop the N. So for example, if you want to know the plural of coração, you can think of corazones, drop the N, and then you know it ends in OES. Should be corações. Same would work with região, regiones, right? But look at grão, which in Spanish is grano, right? If you look at the plural in Spanish, granos, you drop the N, you can see the appropriate ending is aos, right? Grãos. Look at alemán or alemão, right? The plural in Spanish would be alemanes. If you eliminate the N, you're left with AES, and that's the right ending in Portuguese. Alemães. Alright, so let's go ahead and move on to the topic of adjectives. Just as a review, what are adjectives? Well, generally speaking, adjectives are words that modify or describe nouns, words that in some fashion provide additional information about nouns. So here we have the adjectives Brazilian, complicated, fat, large, intelligent, rich, small, and serious, right? I can add those two nouns to modify them, right? A Brazilian city, uma cidade brasileira. A complicated lesson, uma lição complicada. A fat police officer, o policial gordo, right? A very large map, mapa muito grande, right? The smart girls, as meninas inteligentes. A rich country, país rico, right? The small house, a casa pequena. A serious woman, uma mulher séria. So here you can also see that idea of gender agreement. Now, in addition to what we might call descriptive adjectives, words like Brazilian, complicated, big, rich, serious, etc., there are other types of words in Brazilian Portuguese to which the principles of number and gender agreement also apply. You can see a lot of them on this slide, right? I'm not going to go through each one of them, but you can see from the forms here on the slide that they have inflections, right? Different forms to indicate number and gender, or gender and number, right? So things like the possessives, demonstratives, indefinites, or quantifiers. Now, in more recent approaches to grammar, these kinds of words, along with the definite and indefinite articles, are referred to as determiners. But it makes sense to include them or to mention them right here while we're discussing adjectives, because in Brazilian Portuguese, they basically behave like adjectives in the sense that the principles of gender and number agreement apply to them as well. Often when you look up an adjective in either a bilingual or a monolingual dictionary, what you're going to find is the masculine singular form. So for example, if we were to look up the equivalent of the adjective rich in an English-Portuguese dictionary, the word that might be given might only be rico, the masculine singular form. However, to actually use adjectives in speech and writing, we have to know how to modify them so that they can agree with the nouns we want to modify. This means that we need to be able to produce up to 4 different forms, as you can see from these examples. So with, for example, the adjective rico, there's a masculine singular, o homem rico, masculine plural, os homens ricos, feminine singular, a mulher rica, and feminine plural, as mulheres ricas. The same would apply to an adjective like new, right? Novo. We have the 4 forms. Novo, novos, nova, novas. As you can also see from these examples, generating the various forms of an adjective is pretty straightforward when the base form of that adjective ends in O. This is the case with rico or novo, right? You obviously simply swap the O for an A to get the feminine form and add S to get the plural forms. Before going into any further the aspect of number and adjectives, let's focus a little bit more attention on how to make adjectives agree with nouns in terms of gender. Coming up with the right feminine form is usually a function of the final letter or letters of the masculine adjective. So perhaps the easiest way to demonstrate this is to just consider some examples grouped together by category and comment on how the base or masculine singular form is, so to speak, feminized. So if we have an adjective that ends in O, such as caro, expensive, we just change that O to A, cara, right? If you have an adjective that ends in A, like laranja, the feminine form has no change. It's also laranja. The same is true if the adjective ends in the vowel E, triste. Feminine form is also triste. If it ends in the vowel U, like the word cru or raw, right? Then you add, an A, crua. If it ends in the nasal diphthong as in cristão, which is one of the only adjectives frequently used in this category, you change that to So nasal diphthong replaced with nasalized A. Cristão, cristã. Another example, right, is brincalhão, which means the person's a jokester, a really playful person, right? That's changed to ona. And this is when they refer to personality traits. So if you have an adjective that ends in the nasal diphthong and it refers to a personality trait, and really brincalhão is one of the only ones I can think of, the changes to ona in the feminine form. Brincalhona. Mulher, brincalhona. Right? If it happens to end in the combination EU as europeu, right, that EU changes to eia, europeia. So how about adjective forms that end in consonants, right? Same idea, it depends on what that final consonant letter is. The masculine form of a consonant ending in L, like fácil, easy, is the same as the feminine form, fácil, no change. If an adjective ends in M, there aren't too many, but things like jovem or ruim, there's also no change to the feminine, right? Homem jovem, mulher jovem. If it ends in R, also no change, right? Circular, masculine, circular, feminine. If the adjective ends in DOR, as in hardworking, trabalhador, you simply add a, trabalhadora, right? If it ends in S, or more commonly, right, circumflex ES, and most of these are actually adjectives of nationality, francês, chinês, right, japonês, that S changes to esa, right? Masculine, francês, feminine, francesa, chinês, chinesa, right? And if it ends in Z, there is no change. So the masculine form of feliz and the feminine form is also feliz. Now most adjectives, in terms of their pluralization, or excuse me, in terms of their feminization, do follow the rules that we've seen on these previous two slides, but there are a couple of examples that are very common, and those are good and bad. Masculine form of good is bom, feminine, boa, right? Bad is mau, feminine is má. So those are important enough that you need to memorize them and keep those in mind. Okay, so we've just looked at how to modify adjectives to agree with the gender of nouns, right? How to feminize masculine adjective forms. Now let's take a closer look at the issue of number and adjectives. If we're going to use an adjective to modify the plural form of a noun, then we need to pluralize that adjective. Now in general, adjective forms are made plural by applying the same methods we saw a few minutes ago when we talked about pluralizing nouns. In other words, it depends on the final letter or letters of the adjectives. As with nouns, adjective forms tend to fall into three categories based on their endings, right? A lot of them end in vowels, whether accented or not. You have some that end in the nasal diphthong ang, although not as many in terms of adjectives as we saw with nouns. And then many adjectives also end in consonants, the consonants L, M, R, S, or Z. So on the next few slides, what I'm going to do is present examples of singular masculine and feminine forms, and you'll be able to see how the same rules for pluralizing nouns based on their endings also apply to the pluralization of adjectives. Okay, so as you might have guessed, singular adjective forms that end in vowels are the easiest to pluralize. You simply add S. So expensive, caro, you just add S, caros. Doesn't matter if it ends in a feminine vowel, such as cara, you just add S, caras. Triste, tristes. Europeu ends in a vowel, europeus. Europeia ends in a vowel, europeias. Cristã, the feminine form, ends in a simple vowel, cristãs, right? Alemã, feminine form, German woman, alemã, alemãs. Same with brincalhona, brincalhonas. Trabalhadora, trabalhadoras. Francesa, francesa. So, adjective ends in a vowel, and we're talking about other than the nasal diphthong ão, we simply add S. Now speaking of that nasal diphthong ão, right? Most masculine adjectives that end in ão are pluralized. Maybe not most, but the most common one at least, cristão in my book, is pluralized by simply adding S. But there are a few that take other endings, right? Alemão, alemães, or brincalhão, brincalhões. Now the good news is there aren't a lot of adjectives in this category, adjectives ending with the nasal diphthong ão, so you won't come across them or need to use them very often as adjectives. That's the good news. Of course, there are some adjectives that end in consonants. So let's take a look at some adjectives that end in the consonant L. Fácil, difícil, pastel, as in the adjective pastel color, right? In these cases, you're going to remove the EL or the IL and add the EIS or AS ending, right? Fácil, fáceis. Difícil, difíceis. Pastel, pastéis. The most important two are the first two, right? Fáceis and difíceis. Very common adjectives. In the case of adjectives ending in M, the M is replaced with NS. And remember, a syllable final M or NS, what it really does is it nasalizes the vowel or vowels in front of it. So, jovem, right? Homem, jovem would be homens, jovens, right? Ruim, ruins, right? So, remove the M, add NS, but don't pronounce them as you would in English. They're nasalizing forces. If you want to use an adjective that ends in the consonant R, it's very easy. You pluralize it by adding ES. Circular would be circulares. Trabalhador, hardworking, trabalhadores. Right? Again, if it ends in a vowel, trabalhadora, you just add S. Trabalhadoras. And in the case of adjectives ending in Z, of which there aren't a lot, you make them plural by adding es. So capaz, in other words, capable, capaz, made plural by adding es. Capazes. Feliz, happy, felizes, just add es. And finally, to pluralize most adjectives ending in s, just add again es. So you have francés, franceses, chinés, chineses. And so yeah, adjectives of nationality ending in s like these are probably the most important and common group in this category. Another one would be japonés, japoneses. Okay, by now it should be abundantly clear that the grammatical categories of masculine and feminine and singular and plural pertain to three key parts of speech: articles, nouns, and adjectives, not to mention determiners. What this means for actual language use is that when we use any two or three of these together in speech or writing, everything has to agree in terms of gender and number. The key element, what determines whether everything needs to be masculine or feminine or singular or plural, is of course the noun. So simply put, any articles and adjectives or determiners used must agree with the noun in gender and number. So to illustrate and reiterate this concept, let's go over on the next couple of slides a few examples of proper or grammatical article-noun-adjective agreement. Pay attention to how all of the articles and adjectives reflect the number and gender of the noun. So on this slide, if we wanted to express, I don't know the Chilean professor, professor is masculine and singular. So our article and our adjective forms also need to be masculine and singular, right? Eu não conheço o professor chileno, right? If the professor were a woman, I might say, eu não conheço a professora chilena, right? If I want to express, Teresa's watching the new soap opera, Teresa está assistindo a nova novela. Teresa está assistindo a nova novela. So because novela is feminine, not because it's a girlish or female thing to do to watch soap operas, it's because novela just is grammatically feminine. So new soap opera, the new soap opera, I have to use the forms a and nova with novela. If I want to express he wants to buy a cheap car, I'm thinking carro, singular masculine, so the indefinite article needs to be and the adjective form has to be barato. Ele quer comprar carro barato. We're looking for a cute or a pretty house. House is what we're keying in on, right? The noun. A casa, feminine, singular. A gente procura uma casa bonita. And let's look at four more examples very similar to those previous four, just to drive home this idea that in phrases, right, clauses, sentences, if we're using an article and noun or an article, noun, and adjective together, they all have to agree in number and gender. They all have to agree, I should say, in number and gender. So if I want to say, I love the old Bruce Lee movies, right? Filme is masculine, but filmes is masculine and plural. Eu adoro os antigos filmes de Bruce Lee. Or if I want to say, Luciane wants to visit the Greek Isles. Islands in Portuguese, that's a feminine noun. Ilhas, right? Luciane quer conhecer as ilhas gregas. Right? So there is, if I look up Greek in the dictionary, it's going to be grego, right? But since I'm modifying isles, it has to be feminine and plural. As ilhas gregas. Can you recommend some interesting books to me? Você pode me indicar uns livros interessantes, right? Because livros in this case is masculine and plural. Uns livros interessantes, right? We're keying off the noun. They make some really delicious pizzas at that restaurant, right? Pizzas are feminine and plural. Fazem umas pizzas deliciosas nesse restaurante. Okay, so we've covered agreement. We've covered gender and number when it comes to nouns and adjectives and even articles and determiners. We've seen how that all goes together. I want to switch gears just really quickly and extremely briefly touch on the concept of subject-verb agreement. Okay? The concept of agreement or concordance relates in a slightly different way to subjects and verbs. If you recall, in Lesson 3, we discussed the subject pronoun positions of Brazilian Portuguese. And in Lesson 7, we went over the basics of verb conjugation. So you can go back and look at Lessons 3 and 7. The principle of subject-verb agreement is simply the idea that the actual verb form we use in a sentence, what's often called the conjugation or the conjugated form, has to coincide with the appropriate form of a given subject pronoun. So here I'm showing you again that typical grid you're going to see throughout the lessons, right? Where we're breaking out the subject pronoun positions as first person singular, first person plural, right? Third person singular, etc. The idea of subject-verb agreement is this idea that if I'm using the verb falar, I have to use the right form for my subject. So in keeping with that principle, right, if I want to use the verb falar, to speak, the form I use depends on the person I'm talking about, the person doing the speaking. Some examples of grammatical usage, subject-verb agreement would be eu falo português e inglês, right? It's me doing the speaking. It doesn't matter how many things come after that. So it's the singular first-person form. Eu falo. If I want to ask, do you speak German? Você fala alemão? Can't use any other form. José sempre fala com seus amigos. He always speaks. Have to use that form. Remember that in Brazilian Portuguese, or actually I might not have mentioned it in this lesson series yet, the pronoun a gente actually means we, but it takes the singular form, right, of the verb falar in this case. A gente fala de coisas interessantes. It means we speak about interesting things. But if I want to use the nós pronoun, right, I have to use the verb form that corresponds. Nós falamos com ela todo dia. Or nós falamos de coisas interessantes. You guys, or they, vocês falam demais na aula. You guys talk too much. You guys talk too much in class, right? Or I could say they talk too much. Eles falam demais na aula. Right? If it's a couple or three women, I might say elas falam demais na aula. Again, the point I'm trying to make, and it's obvious, you already know this, just review, is that the verb form has to agree with the subject pronoun position. And then a shout out to my sister-in-law and my mother-in-law, Aline e Eliane falam chinês, mas não falam russo. So again, I have a plural subject, Aline e Eliane, have to use the plural form of the verb, falam chinês. Now, another thing to remember that I'll point out right here is that because the verb endings in Brazilian Portuguese correspond or correlate fairly rigorously to subject positions that determine them, it's not always necessary to explicitly mention subjects or to even use subject pronouns, especially when speaking in the first person singular, eu, or plural, nós, right? Or if the subject is clear from context. So I might simply say, falo português. I don't need to say, eu falo português. If obviously I'm talking to you and referring to you, I don't have to say, você fala alemão? I can just say, fala alemão? Right? If everyone knows we're talking about José, I can just say, sempre fala com seus amigos. Right? Or if I say, falamos com ela todo dia, well, that form can only refer to us or to we, so I don't have to say nós. Right? Just wanted to remind you guys of that. And finally, I promise this is the last slide. You might wonder what happens if you screw up subject-verb agreement. I mean, is it that big of a deal? I'd say yes, it really is. For example, if someone were to ask, você fala português? Or make the statement, elas falamos português. That kind of subject-verb disconnect sounds extremely ungrammatical. You will be corrected, right? And although the use of você verb forms with the second person tu may occur in colloquial speech in certain regions of Brazil, you'll sound more educated if you stick with você and its corresponding forms. So you should say, mas você fala português? You shouldn't say, mas tu fala português, even though you might hear that in certain colloquial settings. And you should say, você sabe, porque sabe is the form that goes with você. Você sabe onde fica a farmácia? You should say that. That's grammatical. You'll sound educated. You shouldn't say, tu sabe, onde fica a farmácia, even though some native speakers in certain regions, in certain situations might say that. So again, my advice, if you want to speak directly to the person you're talking to, use você and the form that goes with você. Alright, that's it for Lesson 8 in my Basic Brazilian Portuguese course. Hope you found this information on article, noun, adjective, and subject-verb agreement to be clear, informative, and useful. If so, do me a favor, please share it with others, and let me know if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, okay? Be sure to catch my next lesson in this series, and don't forget to look for me on your favorite social media platforms. I'm just about everywhere. Thanks very much for watching, and be sure to visit the Professor Jason channel again soon. Até breve. Tchau.
Eu vou pra Oslo, pra sair no Oslo Dum. Bloco A.